Okay, it's 7 o'clock. We will open this meeting of the Kenmore Planning Commission. First item of business is citizen comments, and I do not see any citizens, so we will move to the next one, which is approval of the August 20th, 2019 Planning Commission meeting minutes. Do we have a motion on that?
Motion to accept.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes of the August 20th Planning Commission meeting. All in favor say aye. All opposed say no. I will abstain because I was not at that meeting. Next item is accessory dwelling units, so invite up our city staff and Jordan.
Good evening, Planning Commission. So on tonight's agenda, it's accessory dwelling units, and what staff has prepared for you is draft code amendments. And so the intent tonight is to address any outstanding comments or questions that you may have. And if those are all addressed this evening, then we would then schedule a public hearing for your November 19th meeting. And then following the public hearing, if there are any changes that need to be made following the public hearing, we would then look to schedule a joint meeting with the council in January where you would then present your recommendations. So I know several of you attended the Missing Middle panel last week, and I thought it was a great discussion. The experts kind of provided great information about that topic. So if you had any questions about the panel meeting or any questions that particularly pertain to accessory dwelling units, that's also can be part of the discussion this evening.
Yeah, I think that is a good place to start. I know that Commissioner Greathouse was there and Commissioner Olson was there. You guys have any thoughts about things you heard or things you took away from the meeting? I jotted down a few things, but happy to hear from my colleagues on that as well.
I guess one of the things that that resonated with me was the fact that it wasn't necessarily affordable housing. I thought what they're doing is very creative, and I like that aspect of it, and it gave me a lot to think about there. But still, it's not affordable.
Relatively affordable
Right.
was the phrase that was used. Yeah, I noticed that as well.
Yeah, and sort of building on that, I think if I got this figure correct, I can't remember who said it, but Seattle's had ADUs. I think you said maybe legal since 1994, and only 2% of the parcels have ADUs in 25 years. So it's a slow uptake, and maybe it'll increase as they've sort of liberalized their ADU rules. But I think that's another thing. They're not necessarily always affordable, and they're certainly not going to solve by themselves. It's an important piece, but I think it's just that a piece is one thing I took away from that.
I don't remember if the panel addressed owner occupancy. There was a lot of information that came our way, and I don't remember that particular conversation, but I do seem to recall additional parking requirements being addressed, and they were thinking of that as a lever that cities like ours had the option to manipulate, which I can only assume they think we could relax on the parking requirements, and that might be more unique to a Seattle environment than ours, where not as much of our facilities are walkable, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought one of the more compelling speakers was the architect who sat, I think, in this position and talked about the home he had developed for himself with an attached ADU. Actually, I think he described it as an attached ADU, but just barely attached. Mm-hmm. Maybe he's got a covered walkway joining the two properties, but I think his perspective was probably unique to the Green Lake neighborhood where there were more walkable services than we have. So as much as I appreciated that part of the conversation, I'm not sure it would have me rethink our parking conversation that we've had to date.
Right.
Am I wrong in not remembering that? Well, I can't be wrong in not remembering something. Does anybody else remember a conversation about owner occupancy that may have come up that I might have missed during that meeting?
It may be in passing, I just don't
I
remember
don't
being a.
think that that was specifically discussed.
Okay.
I mean, I don't remember that was.
I don't remember it, but that's.
Yeah, I think I agree with Vice Chair Mulcair on the parking. I mean, I think we've already, so Lori, if you could sort of just refresh our memories. As we have it tentatively now, we have said one additional parking spot per new ADU, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so what if somebody had, there's obviously some instances where 2 ADUs would be allowed under our proposal. So that theoretically, if someone had a 2-car garage and a driveway and had already 3 cars and 2 ADUs, so theoretically it could lead to additional on-street parking?
Yeah,
What would you,
that's kind of always the case. So, as we talked about previously, there's a 2 parking stall requirement per single-family dwelling. And then because the city requires a 20-foot setback in front of a garage, if there's a 2-car garage, technically there are 4 parking spaces on the lot. So if the person living in the primary house had 3 cars and 2 ADUs, well, maybe you could run into a parking problem, but there's no way to predict that. And as always, we say, do you want to move to the worst possible case when you're making parking requirements?
True. That would, you tend to be an extreme example, I think. Anybody else have any thoughts on the parking? Because that was one of the things that he did, that was mentioned as a means to encourage ADUs is to relax that requirement.
I'm not so concerned in that scenario that you just described. I think that a really likely scenario that we're going to see, certainly with the attached ADUs, may be an aging in place parent or family member, which I think would be less likely to be adding parking pressures to the neighborhood. With an attached ADU there, I think you might be looking at a more independent living situation, and so a car is likely. But I think the language that we've got to date is probably satisfying most of the foreseeable situations.
Anybody else have any thoughts on the parking specifically? I know we've gone over this before,
I just
any of your
have
thoughts?
a question. And so I'm thinking about in Seattle where they have parking permits in neighborhoods, and so there's designated parking for people who live there. Do you all know if you pay for those permits if you're in the neighborhood or if you're granted them?
I don't think you pay. I think it's a parking strategy in some neighborhoods. I think you have to petition. I'm not sure the exact process, but I don't think you pay for it.
Okay. Yeah, because it seemed like one of the speakers was talking about not giving parking away for free. Do you guys remember that? And so I don't know if he was advocating for, in the future, requiring some kind of paid permitting for on-street parking. I don't think we're anywhere close to that now, but I was just curious.
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
I've lived in at least one neighborhood in my lifetime that's required neighborhood parking permits or stickers, and there wasn't necessarily a charge for it, but what there was a requirement that the registration address of the vehicle matched the neighborhood in which I wanted to live. And if you're a transient type person or maybe a college student, you may not do that, if you know what I mean. You may not retitle your vehicles or register your vehicles in that particular neighborhood if you're not going to be living there for, somewhat of a long term. So I think that kind of helps regulate, even without a fee. that the people that get those parking permits have some more than casual connection to the neighborhood.
Yeah, one of the things that I kind of took away was, I think multiple people mentioned the need to work with the neighbors and engage neighbors. I know we have a public hearing and a public process, and obviously the council will have that as well. And I think that one of them actually suggested sort of targeting neighborhoods. Maybe he was talking more about a large city like, Seattle that has very defined and I think well-organized neighborhoods. I don't know if that would be something that would even be feasible to consider for Kenmore, is to start on some kind of targeted basis. I don't think so. But does anybody else have any thoughts about that? I mean, certainly the neighborhood engagement is huge, because that's where the neighborhood impacts obviously will arise, or at least in discussion. So that's an important part of our deliberations in the councils as well.
So are you talking about involving the neighbors has two meanings to me. One would be if you're going to be developing in a particular neighborhood or area, going out and engaging them so they know what's going on. And then the other would be to solicit a particular neighborhood for that development. Is that?
Yeah, the second part, I think that's what one of the speakers suggested, but again, that may be only applicable to Seattle, where they can, or a large city where they can target it. I guess my thought on that was, just to make sure we get as much input from the, single-family residents as we can, and I guess we have the process already in place to do that, so.
We'll be doing what we typically do, which would, we can do a press release, we can do it on the e-newsletter, we can get it out to all the listservs, we can put information on the website. So doing on the social media, so we typically do all those things. I don't think there's going to be a citywide newsletter coming up within the next couple of weeks that would help us for the Planning Commission, but we can certainly look at the newsletter before council adoption to see if there's something where it would kind of line up, where we could put a little piece in the mailed newsletter.
Right. I also think that when they were having that conversation, I'm not sure it was targeted specifically to ADUs. The context of that discussion was more duplexes and cottage housing, particularly cottage housing in neighborhoods. That would have, that's a larger development at a higher density. I guess I don't feel that the same level of outreach is necessary for the ADU regulations. They're already allowed in the city, both. Certainly, we want to let the public know. It is a change to have one detached and one attached. We're allowing them on smaller lots potentially. So that's not insignificant, but I'm not sure it rises to the level of, for example, something like cottage housing or allowing duplexes in single-family neighborhoods.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. I appreciate that, yeah. All right, anything else from that meeting that anybody wants to bring up or discuss? I think we're good. Did you all hear anything that you thought would bear on at least our deliberations here for ADUs that we haven't already brought up?
I did not hear anything that would sort of give sort of pause that we'd either missed anything or that gave anything sort of new that we hadn't thought of. So I didn't really hear anything that would really change where we are right now.
I agree. I think the things that I highlighted from my notes about ADUs really had to do with sort of the non-code aspects of ADUs, the education and outreach, the extra help at the counter. It actually falls into the category of those other than code amendment kinds of issues that we had or described in some of the early memos on the project.
Okay. Was I correct in understanding that the woman who chaired the meeting was the replacement at Arch for Arthur?
Correct.
Wonderful. Do you recall how long she's been in that role? Is she a new hire, or?
It's been about a year.
Oh, wow.
Right. I think it was maybe November of last year.
No kidding. Yeah. I thought she did a great job with the meeting.
Yeah, she did a really good job. I complimented her
Yeah, good.
on that.
Okay, now I guess you want us to turn to the amendments, and what, is that
Right.
the next phase? Do you have a presentation, or do you want us? what's
I
your-
just wanted to make a couple of comments. We can go through, as always, either point by point or by exception, which means if you have questions or concerns about specific sections. But I did want to pass along a couple of comments from staff reviewers. These are not incorporated into the amendments, but they're worth considering. And the first one was a conversation I had with Mike Stanger from Arch, and he was making a point that if the goal of limiting the size of ADUs is to preserve more open space on the lot, we need to think carefully about that, because an existing house could be, or a new house, could basically take up all that area anyway. And so he and I went back and forth over this and kind of came to the conclusion that maybe it wasn't so much preservation of open space as making sure, in tandem with that, that the accessory dwelling unit was smaller. It's a smaller unit than the primary unit. So as I was thinking back to those initial comments you had about accessory dwelling units, accessory in our planning language usually means it's subordinate or smaller or something like that, but those words didn't actually appear in the discussion. We were focused more on open space, and as Mike said, you could design a really big, ugly house that would have worse neighborhood impact than a smaller house and a detached ADU. So I just wanted to pass that along. I didn't ultimately change what was being recommended. Mike was supportive of the 1,000 square foot limitation for larger lots. He felt that was appropriate, but it was just an interesting conversation. And then the other comment I wanted to make was from one of the building permit reviewers, who was pondering whether the size restrictions should apply to building footprints rather than to total square footage. So maybe your footprint can be 600 or 800 feet, but then you have a 2-story limitation. Again, we discussed that and felt that, well, that's not quite what the Planning Commission's direction was, that we really were talking about smaller units and either smaller 1-story or even smaller footprint if you went to 2-story, but that we didn't think that allowing a larger footprint was quite right. So I just wanted to point those out. You saw that we had provided a whole series of new scenarios, thanks to Jordan. And that led us to the conclusion that there should not be detached ADUs on lots smaller than 4,500 square feet. And so otherwise, I think that the amendments reflect the direction that you gave us. And again, we can either go through them one by one, or you can approach it through questions.
Any preference as to process on that?
I prefer by exception only because
Already.
I've looked through it and
Been
have
there,
my
done that.
comments ready, but if others haven't looked through it in detail, then going point by point could be more efficient for them, I suppose.
Okay, one by exception. Any other?
Exception. I think we've gone through this a number of times, and I'm not sure
It would.
it makes sense to go through it line
All
by
right.
line.
Okay, exception it is. So. Thoughts?
Oh, as far as my exceptions?
Yeah, so we're gonna go through
Okay.
exception rather than by section, so.
And by doing that, I may not go in a particular order. I guess my first question, well, for one thing, I really like the draft language.
Oh,
I
good.
thought that really reflected our conversations to date. I think where appropriate, you've simplified a lot of it by taking out some of the either or and the 50% versus, I found that very complicated, the first read-through we did together of existing language. So I think this, in its straightforwardness, it certainly seems like an improvement. I also like the flexibility built in with the city manager being in a position of looking at discretionary cases or exception cases. I think that's super helpful as well. I see in the section E, maximum ADU sizes, it looks like we're using that section almost to establish definitions of ADUs, attached and detached. Was that the intention? And were we eliminating from an earlier draft of this a point where we had a definitional section that described what an ADU and a detached and an attached were?
So in the current code, accessory dwelling unit is defined, and attached, there's some conversation in that definition about attached ADUs, but there's no definition of a detached ADU. So when we had finished our discussion tonight, I was going to talk about two definitions particularly. One was detached ADU, and the other is pre-existing footprint of a house, which is something we call out here. So I was anticipating new definitions there. And as long as we're on the topic, my initial recommendation is that a detached ADU is a structure that is separated by a minimum of 5 feet. And I chose that. The illustrations show a house, and then they show an ADU that basically looks like it's facing the house. In a case like that, I was thinking, 10 feet would be preferable there. But you could turn the ADU so that the side of the ADU faced the house. And in that case, I felt that 5 feet was probably appropriate. So my intention was to write a definition of detached ADU that talked about it being a structure that contained all the components of an accessory dwelling unit, but was separated by a minimum of 5 feet from the primary structure. I don't know if that gets to your question, or if you have thoughts about that.
No, but I love that conversation too, and I'm looking forward to digging in on that one with you a little bit. To my original point where I thought we were introducing definitions into the minimum
Maximum floor area?
maximum size requirements, I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I think
Okay.
If, though, we're going to have a conversation later about having some additional, then I would say let's keep an eye on our language so that we, for example, if you put in definitional content, then I think you can take it out of here, right, out of sections 1 and sections 2. You don't have to redefine what an ADU or a detached ADU is at that point.
It would be in the definitions, which are a different chapter and are italicized in the actual code amendments.
Understood.
Okay. I'm still
But-
not getting to your
Okay,
point.
so just as then by example,
Okay.
in section E1, attached ADU,
Okay,
it says if the accessory dwelling unit is attached to that feels definitional to me.
correct.
And if we have that as if that stands alone somewhere else as a definition, then I think you can clean that up. and
Eliminate
simply
that
refer to
clause.
it as an attached
Yes,
ADU.
correct. Thank you.
Similarly, for section 2, we describe what a detached is, and I get, and I like what you're saying, that this maybe is the first time we kind of tackle that, of describing what it is, notwithstanding your 5-foot buffer. And then in section F, just below that, when the primary and accessory dwelling units are located in the same building, that's a little different language than I guess we've used before to define an attached ADU. And again, I would say I like the idea then of having a standalone definitional section, and then let's refer
Okay.
back to that, or just call it what we've defined it as. I know I'm being kind of semantic on that, but.
It shortens it up, which is always a good thing.
Yeah. And then, if you don't mind, I wanted to comment on your detached not being closer than 5 feet. What made you think of 5 feet, Lori?
I think 5
sorry,
feet
Debbie.
is the building code separation requirement.
Yeah.
So there would be, Jordan, do you remember if, I think you asked them whether 5 feet was the number? Do you remember?
I
It's
do believe that 5 feet is the building code requirement for the distance from an accessory structure to the primary unit.
Right, it's 5 feet. Sometimes I've heard 3 feet in terms of building separation, but I think that's way too close. That looks like a single structure, where I thought 5 feet, it's comparable to a side yard, the dimension that we expect in a side yard. And I think you would have a sense of separation if you would see the building separation if you were a neighbor.
And what do you think the logic behind that building code separation is? Why do you think that exists?
I think it's a fire safety
Yeah.
issue.
And I do too. And do you think that that would be the same buffer that would be between two primary residences on adjoining lots?
On adjoining lots, because of the planning setbacks, it could be anywhere from 10 to 20, like 20 feet. So the separation.
Are you saying 10 is a minimum, 2 5-foot setbacks for either
Correct.
property?
Right.
So I'm wondering if that's a safety issue, if that's a fire safety issue, right, where building,
I don't think that those setbacks were established as fire safety. I really think 5 feet is the fire safety issue.
right,
And I think that 10 feet was a planning open space
I see,
issue.
okay.
I can confirm that.
Yeah, my only concern is that we don't make it any smaller than our fire experts say would be safe.
Right.
Because in all aspects, a detached ADU is essentially a home, right? With full electrical service and a kitchen and and natural gas perhaps. So I think all of the risks of residential fire exist with a detached ADU that you have with a second primary residence on an adjoining lot. So I wouldn't want to compromise our fire safety.
Right. I will double check that.
Okay. That's it by way of my acceptance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Others have things they want to ask about or clarify or otherwise discuss? Okay, I just had a couple. Let's see, like Vice Chair Mucker, I liked the city manager's opportunity to kind of give exceptions to the owner occupancy, and I'm struggling to find where that is right
It's
now.
section I. It's on the second page of the amendments.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I do want to say that if city manager is in italics.
Or is his-
In the
his or-
definition section, it's city manager or her designee. And
Designee,
typically,
okay.
for this section of the code, it would be the development services director,
Right.
would be the actual person that does it.
Well, now we don't like it anymore.
I just wanted to kind of make that clarification, because I know, I just remember before that it's come up, why is the city manager doing all this stuff? And it's just that it's just written in there just for sort of simplification, that then it can be designated to whomever, so.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good idea. Maybe I just had a little hesitation about the wording of employment, illness, or other circumstances, because there's probably a lot of different circumstances, and I just wondered if there might be just a way to, because employment, say somebody got a job that's somewhere else and they'd have to leave, but how far? I mean, it seems like I know that it's determined by the city manager designee, but I just wonder if that's a wordsmith, if we can wordsmith that a little more artfully and perhaps more broadly, so there's still discretion by the city, but it doesn't specify, is what I was thinking.
So the limitation is only 1 year.
Right.
That helps probably.
Oh, definitely,
So are
yeah,
you
yeah,
thinking
yeah.
employment, what are you thinking would be valid reasons? And that will help me.
Well, yeah, certainly, certainly the illness or, family circumstances or, business circumstances. Maybe the word employment kind of stuck out as, well, what does that mean? Maybe it's more like business circumstance or health reasons or family circumstances. I just wonder if there might be a little more broad language, that's all. I'm not saying it could be gamed necessarily, but that's my belief.
So with the employment, that was, I think the example we gave was that someone was transferred to a different city or
Yeah,
something as
yeah.
part of their job.
Yeah, there could be just maybe business circumstance or health reasons or, maybe this is the word employment. I think you're right, but just didn't care for that wording. That's just my little, my little thing.
What about like business requirements, health reasons, or family
Yeah,
circumstances?
something along those lines would be, that would be my,
Is that,
it's just, I know it's wordsmithing, just.
okay?
Yeah. And the other one I was kind of curious about, and I really appreciate the scenarios that you put together, and Jordan, you did those, correct? Yeah, they're great. I wonder, and I don't think it affects anything of our deliberations, but there may be circumstances in which an ADU would not go sort of behind a house. It might go, say, you have a large corner lot with a house that's kind of set back. Theoretically, ADUs could go anywhere on the property as long as they met the setback requirements, right? So I know all these scenarios, I'm sure this will be the more common case, but it is possible that we could see ADUs popping up, basically on a street side, correct? But that's probably going to be the exception, based on the way most homes are set up, where the open area is either in the back or in the side yard relative to the street, correct?
I think probably the most important factor for determining where the ADU would go would be where the garage was. So if someone, for example, wanted to build a 20-foot, I guess they only have to have a 20-foot drive for 20 feet in front of the garage. So I suppose you could have a single driveway back that opened up to a bigger driveway to the garage. But whether somebody would want to invest the additional money to make a longer driveway, that I would think might be the issue that would lend itself a development, for example, not moving the house to the back of the lot. But there's nothing in these regulations that would prohibit an ADU from being at the front of the house. I think that's not the typical layout, but
Right, that would probably, I'm sure it would be an exception. And theoretically, they would still have the 10-foot setback, correct?
20-foot street side
20-foot
set.
street side, okay. So it wouldn't be quite as much on the street as it would be against the back
Right.
or side part of the house then. Okay. That was just a thought I had. I just wonder if that might be something. I don't
Yeah.
think, again, it would change what we have proposed, but
Okay.
just wanted to.
In fact, that reminds me of a point that I wanted to make in terms of new construction. So we did all of our modeling on a 2,500 square foot house because that is the average. But turns out that's not the average of new construction in Kenmore. Jordan went back and looked at new building information that we had gathered for another project. And he looked at new permits 2012 to 2018, and he found that the average new house was 2,900 square feet. And when you get to a house of that size, on many of the lots, for example, in the R6 zone that were built at, or that have a 5,400 square foot minimum lot size, there was no room for a detached ADU. You just physically couldn't do it. You couldn't put it on the lot. So that was an interesting point, which will certainly restrict the number of detached ADUs that we will see regardless of what regulations we put in place. that was an eye-opener to look at some of those permits. They'll have to have attached ADUs.
If I can, on that section I, talking about the exceptions to owner occupancy, should we consider, should we change the word in the lead-in sentence there, the city manager may consider? Should we change that to the city manager will consider? The reason I bring that up is, do we want this to seem discretionary by the city manager? Or if consider is discretionary into itself, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to get the results you want. It means we're going to consider your case.
Right.
May consider reads to me as if the city manager or his appointee could simply say, I'm not even going to consider your request.
That's the way it would read. And so this would be a case where a person came in with a proposal that seemed obvious that it didn't meet the requirements. And it would be kind of like, why am I going to go through the process of even reviewing this when I know it's not going to be okay? So if we put in shall or will, which are requirements, the city manager shall consider an exception in cases where, again, it's discretionary, but there would always have to be a definitive action of consideration. It's a small point. I mean, presumably nobody would apply for it unless they already knew that they met the criteria.
So are you saying may is the better word choice in this case?
I would say may is the better word choice, but we can put shall in if you want to make absolutely sure that someone who's interested in doing this has the opportunity to go through a review process, even if it's nothing more than submitting information to the city manager and a response provided.
I'm okay either way. I just wanted to avoid if it wasn't intentionally selected, the word may, and it sounds like it was, then I would say we should consider shall or will. But if you think there's some organizational efficiency to staying with may, I'm certainly happy to stick with it. I don't think it's going to, in either word choice, I don't think it's going to change what happens. I just wanted us to be intentional about the word.
I'm going to, Commissioner Lutzis has a question, but I'm going to ask Debbie to respond as well. Do you have any thoughts about whether it's may or shall?
Well, I think in the circumstance, even if somebody came in with a request, I think if it said shall, at least the person who's applying knows that there will be a review done, regardless of whether the material as presented meets it or doesn't. I think it that's the benefit of having it as shall. On may, it means you can kind of get to the door, but you might not be able to walk through it to even get the decision out of it. So I think
Even if you have a bulletproof case with both of the
right,
requirements
because at
met.
that point, then if there is discretion to not even review it, then you've kind of shut the door, whether it's a valid case or not, and then you're into a whole other process to say. So I think you probably get to the same point. I hear it. I hear the merits on both sides, actually. So.
I was going to jump in and respond on this as well, just hearing both sides of this. And Lori, I think what you're saying makes sense and makes some of the most sense, especially when these two examples or two exceptions are a lot more broad, and when it just gives kind of broad terms of what some of these exceptions can be instead of finalized cases or concrete examples. I think a may would be more appropriate with those broad kind of examples we have, because we could be getting a lot of different kind of input, a lot of different applications for these exceptions. And if we had those more concrete examples that people would know that they fit the criteria, then a shall, I think, would play into this better. But because it's so broad and so kind of vague, especially the last part, which we already addressed, the other circumstances, but until that's changed, I think may might be the better option for that. But that's just, my opinion.
I'm I'm fine with May.
Mr. Editor?
Yeah, I'm fine with May as well. Yeah, so.
I would have suggested shall, but I'd have been happy with April, so.
Planning Commission meeting. That's great. Commissioner Olson.
I did have a further question or discussion on I. I guess from my grammatical background, I was a little concerned about shall be removed if one of the dwelling units ceases to be owner occupied. Well, what if you started off with two of the units being owner occupied? It almost might be better if none of the dwelling units are owner occupied. It's just trying to read it literally. But that was not my main concern. I was trying to focus on shall be converted to another permitted use. I'd like to have some idea of what we think is another permitted use, or shall be removed, which is an extreme reaction. So I'm trying to make sure I have this clear. Maybe you spent $50,000 or whatever putting in an accessory dwelling unit, and then you have to move. Does that mean you have to remove it? I mean, I'm just trying.
Right. So I like your point about the, I'll start with the second half of that sentence. I like that point about saying if all of the units cease to be owner occupied. Is the rest of the commission okay with that? I think that's a good clarification.
Right.
And then as to what happens, so presumably if you move, you sell the property to someone, the notice is on title that there's an accessory dwelling unit and it has to be owner occupied. So when the new person moves in, presumably they are going to be there and either they will have people in the ADUs or they won't. If for the removal, if it got to the point where a removal was required, the kind of things that you would do for the removal would be to take out the kitchen. It wouldn't be to destroy the structure. You would convert it to an accessory structure like an office or something like that that didn't have the components of a living unit. So that would be an extreme case. In fact, I'm finding it kind of hard to understand. I suppose unless you had a total scofflaw who moved to a totally different place and then was continuing to rent out the units as accessory dwelling units, even though they continued to own the house, you might have to say the kitchen's got to go. You've got to take out your 220 volt or whatever, and you've got to get rid of the appliances so that no one can cook in this unit. You'd remove the components of the accessory dwelling unit.
I'm trying to figure out the consequences if, one, that's an expense to do that. And I'm just envisioning of people that I have visited in other states where they have an enclosed unit so that when they have guests, they can have their own bathroom, and if they want a kitchenette or whatever, they can do that. But now we're saying you can't do it because it's been called an ADU, and that we could remove it. And I just find in that situation it seems a little extreme. But I also don't want to create a commercial enterprise, because we sort of said that's not where we want to head with this.
So I'm still not following you. So the requirement is owner occupancy. So the owner is there, and then the owner can do what they want with the ADUs. They don't have to rent it out. They can use it as a guest suite. They can give it to family members, whatever they do as the owner. Once the owner is gone, unless they have this exception, then if it's a new owner, they have the same rights. They don't have to use it as an accessory dwelling unit. So you'd be, the situation that you're concerned about would be basically somebody who knew they had an owner occupancy requirement, but they'd moved across the country. And now they're just renting probably the house and the 2 ADUs, and they live in New York. In that case, we would have an enforcement action if there was a complaint. And the solution to that would be that either they would fix the problem, they would sell the property. Converting to another permitted use is probably unlikely since hotel is not a permitted use in single family. But we could then, through code enforcement, require that at least for the ADUs, they remove the, as I said, the features that make it rentable as a dwelling unit. So take out the 2 kitchens from the 2 ADUs. No cooking in those units. Then they become like a detached office, and the person, the scofflaw, who's breaking the law, can't rent them out.
If, taking that scenario just a little further, you have the owner that moves to the East Coast, and he wants to rent it, the whole thing, to a single tenant who may have an aging parent to live in the adjacent one. Based on our explicit language, that tenant couldn't use that unit.
Absent an exception.
Correct.
Well, but the exception is only good for 1 year.
Correct. That's the point of the owner occupancy requirement.
You see, I'm struggling with the extremeness of it. I'll have to think about that some more.
So I'm a little confused here. If somebody buys a house with an ADU on it, are they obligated to, obviously they have to, meet all the ADU requirements in that, including that, but do they have to do anything with it? Can they just kind of leave it be and have it be, I don't know, a storage area or, I mean, so the city's not gonna come in and say, if you're not using this as a dwelling unit, you have to remove the kitchen or other,
No,
so there's no obligation to do that then?
No.
But that's forcing that owner to sell it, to get to a new owner who's occupying it. My example was where the owner goes back to the East Coast for a new job, wants to return to this area, likes his house. And my example was where maybe he could rent the whole unit out to a tenant, and the tenant has an aging parent that they want to use the detached unit for. This explicit language doesn't allow them to do that.
that's correct. If he wanted to rent it out to somebody who wanted to use it as an office or something like that, that would be fine. But the way it's written, you cannot use it as an accessory dwelling unit unless the owner lives in one of the units.
And is the 1 year limit, is that a one-time thing? Can you theoretically keep applying and keep getting an exception, or?
I'd be surprised if that would keep happening because that's de facto getting rid of the owner occupancy
Yeah, okay.
requirement. As written. But, it's your, your code amendments. If you want to change that, you can do that.
I'm going to think about that. I think we can add a third exception that might cover my example, which allows a tenant of the whole facility to be allowed to use the ADU for one of their relatives.
For that period of time,
Well,
for that, up to that 1 year
well,
period?
I guess I'm going to have to look at this a little closer. I would hope that would be a longer exception. If it's a single tenant.
So I guess my question, and listening to that comment is, So why then are we saying that it has to be owner occupied? What was the purpose of that? Because we're identifying now circumstances where that wouldn't be something that we want. So do we need to go back and revisit the owner occupancy requirement?
Or make a very specialized exception.
But still just a year. And I thought what I was hearing you say is that likely if they've moved a parent in, they're probably going to want more than a year. So again, I'm just thinking maybe we should discuss the owner occupancy requirement again.
I'm willing, but I was also appreciative of the fact that we were looking at the thought that if you had an owner occupant, they would take better care of it and be more sensitive to the neighbors. But I'm not sure that a single tenant of everything would be any less sensitive.
Unless that single tenant was operating it as a commercial.
That's why I was trying to make it very limited.
Yeah.
I think we got to to what we have now for the owner occupancy through a lot of discussion. I don't think we need to revisit it as a whole. If we want to look at this one exception, we may, but I don't think we should look at owner occupancy as a whole. I think what we have now works, and if we want to add something, we can look at that.
I think we were pretty strong on the owner occupancy, certainly as a principle.
I did have one question. Did we, I don't have it in my notes, did we ever determine on a one-year exception that time limit? Or was that your suggestion?
That was my suggestion. I don't think you did say.
Okay, I was just curious about where that 1 year came up.
Yeah, I think that was my suggestion.
Okay.
These are meant to be temporary situations, I think, right? From the owner occupancy, requirement, so.
I think it would be worded to cover my situation as well. And you can simply make the city manager may consider an exception to this rule, sub A, for up to 1 year in cases where, and then you do 1 and 2. And then a sub B to this rule, and then talk about the tenant aspect of it, of the whole facility. So it could be by amendment, we could change this so you could have both of them, and you wouldn't be stuck with the 1 year rule.
I want to say that if we wrote an exception to that, I think that would be basically an exception to the owner occupancy requirement. Because under what other circumstances would, if you say that the owner can move and someone can move into the house and rent the house and then use the ADU, you've set up exactly the non-owner occupancy thing that I think was the point of the owner occupancy requirement.
Well, I guess I was disagreeing. The focus of that owner occupancy requirement would be accommodated by where a tenant of the whole facility can use the ADU for one of his relatives, or her relatives. So I'm not sure that violates the concept of where we were after. The purpose or function was to ensure they would be sensitive to neighbors.
Well, personally, I'm having trouble seeing a situation, I think it's already been mentioned, where a tenant would want to have a family. I see what your point is, but have like an aging parent move in for a year and then go who knows where. I guess I see that as being a pretty rare circumstance.
But
So I don't know
what I
that-
was suggesting was language wouldn't have it as a one-year limitation.
Well, then, yeah,
That's why
then
she
that,
was concerned that it's too much of an exception to owner occupancy.
correct. So you're thinking it should be for more than 1 year under that circumstance, where a tenant would bring in a family member?
Yeah, that would allow a tenant to have a family member there.
That, to my mind, that really changes the owner occupancy requirement personally. But if you want to make a motion, it's your prerogative.
I'll think about what the language might be, and then I'll suggest it a little later.
Any other exceptions or comments, or?
Just a question. It has nothing serious behind it, but what was your thinking behind 1 year as opposed to either a year and a half or 6 months?
I don't think there was any rationale. 6 months, I guess, well, there was. It seemed unlikely to me that someone might take kind of a sabbatical or a business-related position somewhere else for 6 months. So it seemed like it should be longer than that. And then when you go over a year, then it seemed like, well, that doesn't feel temporary to me. I mean, that's my rationale.
Okay.
It's not very good.
I was just curious, thank you. But I think with, if it's under the city manager's discretion as to up to a year, then I think that would be very appropriate. So I agree with your reasoning there.
Because that could cover, 6 months, right, or,
So that's the maximum period of time the owner could be vacant with an exception. What's the minimum trigger? If my wife and I are primary dwelling owners and we decide to spend February in Arizona, every February in Arizona?
It's not specified.
Okay.
And I have seen codes where it is specified. And I guess I just wasn't sure we wanted to go there at these. In fact, I've already had a comment that even this regulation as written is, just like the owner occupancy thing, it's really hard to enforce. And then when we're talking about, well, were they gone for 2 weeks or 6 weeks?
Right.
It just.
And I think this supports your 1 year period, is that what's the likelihood of an owner occupant finding a renter, a tenant for their primary dwelling? Less than a year. I mean, a 9-month lease isn't very common, or a 6-month lease, right? And so even in my fantastical journey down the road of living in Arizona in February, it would be very difficult to imagine renting my home for 4 weeks. I may do a house swap with an Arizona couple that misses the rain, but that isn't really giving up my occupancy. That's vacationing, I guess, at that point. So I think the year is actually pretty well constructed, because I think that maps to most lease periods, tenancies.
So that just made me wonder about whether they could use the facility, the main house and the ADU for Airbnb for that short amount of time.
So we didn't, for which period,
So if it was for the month, or I've just known a number of college professors who've gone for a
Right.
quarter different places, and they've done Airbnb, and so
Yeah.
that just
There's-
popped into my head.
right, there's no restriction on that. Technically, the way this is written, they probably should be telling us, but realistically, I suppose unless we got a neighbor complaint that, they're gone for their month to Arizona and it's party central over there, at that point, we might call their attention to this clause that says you were supposed to ask us if you were going to be gone, and you didn't. I mean, we could.
Yeah, any other exceptions or points people want to make? I know Commissioner Wilson's still thinking about his wording, so is there anything else that you need from us prior pending that?
So we talked a little bit about definitions, and I broached the subject of the 5-foot separation, so it would help to know whether I should proceed in that direction as long as it met the fire department requirements. I'm seeing two heads.
Yes.
Okay, all right. And then the second definition that I needed to ask for direction on has to do with pre-existing building footprint. So this is the case where we have a house and somebody wants to do an attached and a detached ADU. And we've said if you want to do that on these smaller lots, you cannot go outside the pre-existing building footprint for your attached ADU. What's a pre-existing footprint? What we're trying to avoid is a case where someone comes in and they have their house and they build an attached ADU, and then they come back next week or in the next couple weeks and say, okay, now I want to do my detached ADU, and we haven't defined what is the pre-existing building footprint. So my proposal, this would be a definition, is that the pre-existing building footprint is the footprint as it existed 5 years ago. It's enough of a time gap that I think that nobody is probably as Machiavellian as to say, okay, I'm going to build my attached ADU and now I'm going to wait 5 years and then I'm going to propose my detached ADU. We just need to put some time period around it. Maybe 5 years is too long. Maybe it should be 3 years. But something probably longer than a year or two, which might tempt someone to wait us out.
Could you word it in a way that said original footprint excluding all ADU additions?
I could, I think my hesitation there would be a house that, where the ADU was built 10 years ago. And then, so you could say you have to exclude the area of the ADU, but that seemed a little, I don't know, that just, for one thing, it would be difficult potentially to track down the permits. So we'd have to go, single-family permits typically aren't saved, so there's a retention period. 5 years just seemed a little more manageable, but I can look at retention requirements for building permits and see if we could go back a greater distance, or back even to the time of the creation of the ADU, if you think that would be better.
Okay.
Yeah, I personally like that idea, yeah.
Okay.
Because I think, I mean, you're trying to avoid the Machiavellian who's going to do, you know, his attached bigger ADU, right, and then the detached one, and
Right.
so to have a time period on it, I guess I'd prefer sort of Commissioner Lutz's approach personally.
Okay,
Or at least
so,
to-
pre-existing building footprint means the footprint of the building before an existing ADU was
Correct.
constructed.
Yeah.
Is that,
Interesting.
okay, I'm seeing heads nod. Okay, all right. That was the only other definitional thing that I needed your direction on. Thank you.
So I'm trying to play this out in both, now that you brought Machiavelli into the conversation. I'm trying to play
It's
this
an
out
Italian
in
thing,
both,
I'm not sure
in
what
both
you're
scenarios and to see if this holds water both ways. If we,
Yeah.
this is where there's a primary residence and a detached ADU. They can't add an attached ADU that exceeds the original footprint.
Can you clarify, Lori?
I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
was,
Sorry, I was asking Laurie a question.
Okay,
I
that's okay.
apologize.
Mike kind of wanted to clarify.
I'm sorry,
so-
could you?
Yeah, I just wanted to play out this scenario in my head to
Okay.
understand it better. So, in the case where there is a primary dwelling unit and a detached ADU, the owner cannot create an attached ADU that would exceed what we're defining as the original footprint or the pre-existing footprint of the
Correct.
primary residence.
Right?
Could the same result be achieved if they were to do the attached ADU exceeding the original pre-existing footprint first, and then later add a detached ADU? In other words, does your language and your setup here only work in the situation where they do the detached first before the attached?
No. I think where we're headed is that if they already have an attached ADU, then the pre-existing footprint was the area before the attached ADU was constructed, and they cannot expand that. So they basically couldn't do an attached ADU expansion, but they could do a new detached. If they had a detached first, then it was the pre-existing footprint, and they could do an attached ADU if they stayed inside that footprint. So if they did, for example, a basement ADU within the pre-existing footprint, then they could do it. And there's also a clause in that section that says if they come in for a brand new house with a new proposal for an attached and a detached, and these are only on the smaller lots,
Yep.
then we're actually controlling the size, 2,500 square feet for both.
The attached and the primary.
Right, correct.
I could potentially see a conflict, or I just want to ask for your clarification on this. If an owner built an ADU, but then removed a couple of the facilities and absolved it into its footprint, and now it's no longer a functioning ADU, would that count as the footprint, or would that still be considered an ADU by the city's kind of guidelines and restrictions and rules?
As, it would depend. If in fact they eliminated, if there was a kitchen and they got rid of it and now they're using it as their basement rec room or whatever, or storage or whatever they're using it for, it would be part of the pre-existing footprint by the definition that we just talked about.
Okay. But then if they removed those facilities, I'm trying to think about how or why anyone would do this, remove those facilities. So now, well, if they added an addition to the house, that was an ADU, so it expanded the footprint. But then they removed the facilities, so now they have a greater footprint, and then added a detached. Could they, in theory, still put the appliances back in that ADU and now have two ADUs that somehow found its way around by
No,
changing?
because if we're defining pre-existing footprint as the footprint before any ADU.
Okay, my bad. Yeah, okay, I understand. Thank you.
Okay, you have what you need there, Lori, for those two?
Yeah. Debbie was asking me a question because there's another code section that we have to tackle, which I think I have your agreement on, which is that there's a code section that talks about exceptions to rear yards. And this is where we were making an exception that you didn't have to have a 20-foot rear yard for an ADU. You could have a 10-foot rear yard. So that is in, it's section 18.30 of the municipal code, so that would be another change to another section. It's possible that there are other adjustments. Part of doing a code revision is that you write your basic sections, and then you have to go through the whole code and see if there are any sort of conflicting phrases or sections. I don't anticipate any, but that is something that could result in some minor amendments to other sections. I don't anticipate that, but fair warning.
So do we need a vote this evening?
Well, yeah, I wanted to give Commissioner Olson an opportunity to bring up his proposal if he so chooses, before we, get
Well, I was trying to rush it, so he didn't. So do whatever you think is best,
Wait a minute,
Commissioner.
is that due process?
I remind you that this is your preliminary recommendation.
I think we're just looking for a recommendation right now. Is this satisfactory enough to move forward for a public hearing. It's not precluding that you couldn't make any further changes after the public hearing.
I feel like it's fine. I expect that when we have the public hearing, there will be even more creative individuals scrutinizing it than we have up here. And there will be other scenarios that they want to test out. So I think this is, for me, I feel this is a good benchmark.
Okay.
I'm ready to make suggestions, though, if you want to do that before.
It's already come up today. I think we should consider that, sure.
I can be very literal, and so for the first sentence in I, it reads, "The accessory dwelling unit shall be converted to another permitted use or," and I would insert, "or the unit or its kitchen shall be removed if none of the dwelling units are owner occupied." And I wanted to make it very clear that kitchen could be removed rather than unit having to be removed.
If I may, I like your idea. And are you saying insert that or replace removed with that definition? Or not
That is
definition,
the
but that?
first sentence.
Yes, and I'm saying, would you take out removed or add that in between
Yeah, the insert was,
insert?
"or
Okay.
the unit or its kitchen shall be removed." So we left the "shall be removed" language, but I made it clear that you could remove that section, if that will cover the concerns you have.
Yeah, I think we might talk about the accessory dwelling unit shall be converted to another permitted use, or the unit or the, I'll have to look at the exact definition, but there are, I think, 2 or 3 components of,
Yeah,
is that
I'm fine.
okay?
Yes, it is.
So we'd reference the components of the accessory dwelling unit, maybe shall be removed or modified,
That's
something
fine.
like that.
Yeah. So that would be the first
Is that,
motion of amendment. I have several. And if I don't get a second,
So I just have a question about that. So if we're still talking about the scenario where a person is renting it and then the renter wants to bring his family into that other unit, that's what we're talking about?
well, that'll be the next proposed amendment.
Okay.
Because that'll be dealing with what follows for
Because
the
it
exception.
seems like if they're bringing their family to live in the accessory dwelling unit, they would want the kitchen, but it seems like this amendment would require that the kitchen's removed if it's a rental and the owner's not living there.
I'm just trying to live with the intent of the first paragraph, because this says that the unit shall be removed. It doesn't say that you can resolve it by removing the kitchen or the components.
Okay, I'll wait for the rest of it.
Okay. Well, that would be, I guess, Amendment A. The second amendment was to, let's see, the second sentence reads, "The city may consider an exception to this rule for up to 1 year." And I was going to insert parenthetically, renewable, meaning that you could renew it from year to year. In cases where, and then in 1, it says one of the units will be occupied by a spouse. I was going to insert the word by a tenant, comma, spouse, parent, etc., who will act in his or her, meaning the owner's stead, to manage and maintain the property. And then 2, it says there is a documented need. I think what you really want is documented evidence that an owner occupant is leaving due to employment, illness, or other circumstances. The word need has me concerned, because it's voluntary whether you decide to change your employment or where you go to. anyway, those were the changes I was going to suggest to try and deal with the scenario that I was developing.
What's the best way for us to consider that from a process standpoint? I mean,
Well,
I heard what Commissioner Olson said. I want to make sure we all have the language that we're
Right.
looking at before we.
I think it might be easiest, before you move ahead with the language, to discuss the concept. So the concept in front of you is that one of the units may be occupied by a tenant, that the one-year period may be renewable, and that it's more evidence that the owner occupant has to leave the premises rather than a need. So it could be the owner's choice without a need to leave the premises. And if you are comfortable with those concepts, then we can work on language.
That's fair enough.
Maybe we should take these one at a time. They seem to be separate but related. So I guess, well, is that okay with everybody?
I
Or what's,
liked Lori's comment a few seconds ago about having a conceptual conversation before we
Right,
start
right.
wordsmithing.
yeah, no, conceptual, but there's different concepts. There's a tenant, there's
Oh, true.
renewable, there's evidence, there's different, but you're right.
Maybe I'll just chime in with a very what I think is a high-level conceptual comment, that I think we were, as a commission, of the mind that we wanted to maintain owner occupancy as a requirement for ADUs. And then we envisioned, or were opening the door a little bit with this concept. This was what we used to call a hardship exception, right, in the first parts of these conversation. And I think the more we qualify what triggers it, the weaker the owner occupancy language seems, and the less clear we are to the community that we are intent on owner occupancy for ADUs. So for that reason, I think we've been pretty generous with this hardship exception as drafted, and I wouldn't look to qualify it any further for that reason.
I agree with that. I mean, I think, to me, it's either we want to go with the owner occupancy or we don't. And I'm fine with either. I think there are pros and cons to both. I think that when we start trying to qualify each, we're never going to come up with all of the scenarios.
Well, I'm in favor of the owner occupancy with a hardship exception, and I think what we have listed out portrays that in a way, and in a fairly literate way as well. And I think with some of these exceptions, it really does open it up, and it kind of starts to blur the lines of what our intentions were with this.
Yeah, I agree with the comments that have just been made there. And also, in terms of the renewable, I don't think I would favor that either. I think that could go on forever and effectively would sort of gut, an owner occupancy requirement. I do like the word documented evidence instead of need, personally. So I think we have a kind of a consensus on the conceptual part of that, so.
My only pushback on the documented evidence, although I do like that, I think it's either documented need or maybe documented proof that this is going to occur, because there may be the evidence in place, but the owner may choose to move a city over instead of out of the area. They may have the evidence, but they may not act upon that evidence. But if there's that need, then they are going to act upon the circumstances, and then there would be a need for this exception.
Well, it's still up to the city manager designee to determine. So by evidence, he or she can weigh whatever documentation there is.
Okay.
If you wanted, you could say there is documented evidence of the need. Do you like that?
Or documented needs supported by the evidence.
Documented needs supported by the evidence?
I like it.
Yeah, we'll find a compromise in the middle.
There you go. That's good. Okay, so I think you have, yeah, conceptual direction from us on that section.
I do. Let me just clarify.
Okay.
So it sounded like there was not support for the renewable portion, that the other changes related to having a tenant were not supported by the majority, and that we would add something about needing evidence to the second exception. I think the other thing that I heard right was the comment that if you couldn't convert to another use, the unit or components of the unit would need to be modified or removed. So just a little more clarification of
And
that.
We could probably
Is
add-
that,
Yeah.
I see
Mhm.
3 heads.
And we could add that into
Nodding.
definitions under, say, ADU components or ADU facilities or something.
Yeah, that's already actually in
Oh,
the
okay.
definitions.
Yeah.
All right. then.
So,
So that was my question. So if it's already in the definitions, do we still add it here, or is it sufficient?
I think it's a little, I find it helpful to say that the unit or sort of I don't know what the words are exactly at this point, or the critical components that make it an ADU. I don't think that is clear. I think Commissioner Olson has a good point. Okay. I see, I think,
Okay.
4 heads.
Yeah, we're a five-headed
Supporting that?
monster, so.
Okay.
Okie dokie. Anything else you need from us tonight?
No, I think the next step then, we will make those slight changes to these amendments, and then we'll bring those back and schedule the public hearing. And in addition to these amendments, as Laurie mentioned, there might be sort of a couple of corollary amendments that kind of roll through the code. But this won't be a last chance to make any additional tweaks, but this will be
Right.
the language that you'll see. And I think we're looking at, 19th, Laurie, for the?
Right, your
hearing?
second
hearing.
meeting in November
Yeah.
November
19th,
for the public
right?
hearing.
There is typically a sort of a gap meeting in between when we can schedule a public hearing because of the notice requirements. So it couldn't be on the 5th, it has to move to the 19th. Just so you know why it would be the 19th and not earlier.
So will we have the meeting on the 5th? Will we be discussing?
Yep, you'll need to kind of switch your hats back to the pros plan again. And the purpose of that meeting is we'll be bringing back a full draft of the pros plan. So at that meeting on the 5th, it will be an opportunity to kind of see all those component pieces that you've looked at over the several months put together in one document. And we'll be showing sort of significant things in track changes, but not every sort of minor detail. So we can either provide you a copy with track changes and a clean version, or a clean version. We haven't really ironed out those details yet. But that's what will be on the 5th. And as Maureen is out of the office currently, and I will be out of town on the 5th, and it will be, Laurie will be here, but also the consultant who's with Holbeck and Baird will be here as well to kind of give Laurie some support for any questions that come up at that meeting.
Great. Okay, any other business for us?
I guess I had a few questions related to this conversation we just had. Who do you expect we would hear from in a public meeting or around ADUs? What type of constituents would come, and what do you think we're likely to hear?
That's
I know we don't have a magic.
I don't have, I really don't. I mean, I
My
think
next
that,
question is going to ask you to pull even more
oh dear.
random stuff out of the air, but
Well, I guess the random stuff would be, I mean, I remember there was a gentleman, for example, at the panel who was saying, what are you guys doing on ADUs? I want to do an ADU, and I don't think I can do one right now. And I said, well, you know, you should probably tune into the Planning Commission. Those rules are coming right up. So you might hear from people who've maybe come to the counter and have heard, as when they come to the counter, the rules are changing. They may come and kind of voice support or opposition. That's certainly a possibility.
So one of the things I heard was that they were going to offer a real estate certification for ADUs. Did you hear that during the, so it may be that we have real estate agents or people affiliated with teaching those kinds of certification classes.
Unlike the mobile home park project, I have not had, I don't know that I've talked to anyone about the proposed rules. And I know that Development Services is talking about that frequently at the front counter and alerting people to the fact that this process is underway. So I don't know, I really don't know who to expect either of these two groups. It could be that there will not be folks who are wanting to testify. We certainly haven't had the public involvement that we've had with some other projects.
right.
We
Even
can
things
only
like-
do our best to encourage.
Yeah. Usually it's pretty predictable who we're going to hear from, right, and what their positions will be. And
Right.
oftentimes it's two sides of an issue, right, like mobile home parks or tree ordinances, et cetera. This one has me kind of scratching my head of who's really going to, what's their position going to be, and who's going to be, is it going to be developers, is it going to be homeowners, is it going to be the aging community? It'd be interesting to see. I just can't put my finger on it. Then the second question, where I'm asking you to look at a magic 8 ball, then is how do you feel the council will respond to the changes that we've come up with so far and that may survive the public forum process?
Well, I think the council, because they put it on your docket, is supportive of looking at amendments and kind of making the rules streamlined or easier to do. So I think they're certainly in favor of that. I think that the amendments that you've made so far aren't completely out in left field, so I can't imagine that they would be in opposition to that. But again, I don't know. Sure. And then sometimes the public will often show up at the council before the ordinance is adopted rather than at the planning commission, and that's sort of hard to predict as well. So my magic 8 ball isn't working very well on this. And again, sometimes it's hard to know. Sometimes things can be triggered for public involvement on rumor, or I heard that, you know, the world is falling apart, and you know when rules come to pass. You just never know. Haven't heard that yet, so sometimes no news is good news on that front. So I'm not anticipating sort of a huge public outcry either in opposition or in favor. And I think it's probably because the ADU rules currently exist and the changes around them are relatively minor and probably would not have a overall significant impact, which usually is when people get more excited when the rules are more significant or new.
I think when I view this as we've achieved 3 pretty important things. I think we've expanded the opportunity for ADUs by allowing one attached and one detached. I think that's a headline, right? And then I think we have simplified the current process for calculating what you can have and where you can have it. That's pretty important. And then I think we've disambiguated. I think we've taken some of the gray out of it and been more clear. And I think those will be the 3 things the council will respond to, right?
Sounds like you.
And I think from an affordable housing, though, we're not really getting more affordable, but I think from a housing perspective and infill housing, I think we're right on that mark. So I think this would, I would guess it's well received.
I think those would be great points to keep in mind when you present these recommendations to the council.
Oh, I have one other question. One of the things that was discussed was having pre-approved plans for ADUs. So where are we with that, and how would
Right.
we invite people? I don't know if architects come up with those, or if we buy them off of Amazon, or, how that works.
Right. So what I can say is that that's something that a number of jurisdictions are looking at, and some are farther than others in terms of soliciting plans. I also know that the building, I don't know what to call it, the building official or building reviewer group is looking at that. And my understanding is that they may take the lead on that part of the project, sort of a group as a whole. So in terms of what the Planning Commission can do, we haven't really discussed, and we should probably after the hearing discuss some of those other ways to encourage ADUs and see if there are those that you wish to forward to the council to consider. So that might be one that you could forward to them. I think, again, that there's kind of a groundswell of activity right now, and I'm not sure that Kenmore will take the lead, but is participating in a number of efforts and then watching others. For example, I think Kirkland has gone out with requests for proposal for doing detached ADUs, and again, this building permit group is working on that. So.
All right, anything else for the good of the order tonight?
Is this our final meeting before the general election results are available?
November 5th,
The night of
that's
the
the
election.
voting. Our
The
next
evening
meeting.
of?
Yeah.
Well, you'll certainly be a distracted commissioner that evening, won't you? Good luck to all the candidates.
Thank you.
We are adjourned. Thank you.